Hi, this is Tom Broussard. Great to see everyone. We're talking today about another new scientist called William James. Um, some of you might know about William James. It is interesting for a person with stroke and aphasia to learn more about how it is that stroke and aphasia works and how we recover. And before my stroke, I didn't know anything about the brain at all. Since then, that's all I do is think about how the brain works. And William James, as it turns out, after reading all these other scientists that brought me to understanding William James, he is the one who coined the word plasticity, which now in modern times everybody understands it. Whether they fully understand what it really means, yet to be known. But William James, and so many of these scientists I've told you before, in the 1800s, um, he and he's very famous for lots and lots of reasons. Not the least is plasticity. He was one of the founders of, as they say, the American Psychology. He was the one with a couple of others who created this new thing called um, uh, um, which is always difficult for me to pronounce, is pragmatism, basically making philosophy and science more practical, um, and uh, and ended up writing several books. But the one that most everybody knows about is the Principles of Psychology, and he wrote that in 1890. You would think that for some reason, an old book like that, and it's a huge book, it's 1,400 pages, that many people wouldn't know much about William James and this monster book, which requires two volumes. So it's it does require a lot to learn much more about William James and the factors of that book. But chapter 4 is about habit, and that is the first time he used the word plasticity there. In what he describes as all of this is the science of mental life. So basically beginning to understand how the brain works and how we can how we can look at it from our perspectives going forward. So really looking for the processes of how the brain works. And when it comes to plasticity and what turned out to be habit, which is a huge component of the book and everything he talks about, is how we learn and how habit becomes so useful because good habits, which you can do with more repetition and intensity of activities, um, it makes it easier to do those tasks, or in sports or in language. So the more you do those things, the better off you are, because you'll get really good at it, and that means you also get it very quickly and be able to shift from one thing to another and be able to do that because of the habit that you have built. And all of the habit, what happens, and now we get to plasticity, is that um, the way the brain works, it converts, when it comes to plasticity, it converts uh, thought and cognitive activities into new brain matter. Um, and that is how the brain continues to build this beautiful map of roads and uh, smaller roads, and then really small roads that are all connected. Um, and based on how much you think about things and how much you act on a variety of things, reading, writing, speaking is one component, of course, but any amount of music or art, whatever it is that you work on, the more you work on that, the better you'll be. And that all means because you're building habits using plasticity to convert all of that into new brain matter, which then lays down that new map. And the more you do that, the more that map, which is really maps of nerves and the what we call the dendrites and synapses, but the branches and leaves, we convert them into more of them, more connectivity between them, and that all helps people be able to do what they would want to do going forward. Um, the He also was coming to realize, of course, that habit and the brain and learning are linked to education. And he made a great quote, and I'll talk about it here. Education is for behavioral, and habits are the stuff of which behavioral consists. And that led him and us understanding, if you read about James, understanding a lot more about this new science called MBE science, which is in the title of the book. The article is called William James, The Principles of Psychology, Plasticity, and MBE Science. And that is mind, brain, and education. And as he describes all of his work, it leads you to understand now today about MBE science, which combines education, cognitive neuroscience, and educational philosophy, psychology, that has become now MBE science, which has been around for, I'll say, a little while, maybe 20 years. I do forget, but not much more than that. And there's a new nonprofit called the MBE nonprofit. And that has only been around for, I think, 12 years. 13 years recently, and still not a whole lot of people are members of that. I mean, in terms of millions ought to know more about MBE science, and really a few thousand do know about it and find out more about it. But when it comes to William James, what he talked about, now what we talk about in the MBE science world, here are some of the concepts of MBE science, which are also very important because you get to see how far back in time scientists, now more teachers, not enough, but more, to learn more about what we understand to be plasticity coming from William James. So the first concept of MBE science is the brain is highly plastic, right? Where did they come up with that word? Here in modern times, they got it from William James in 1890, even a few years even before that. And each one of these, there are quotes. I won't have to read them all to you now because they'll be in the article that you'll be getting. But the brain is highly plastic, as you have seen from all of the other scientists in this series of the 24. And it is what the brain is. It is plastic. It has this capacity to grow new branches and leaves. And to the degree that we only have 100 billion neurons, that's the trunk of that metaphorical tree, branches, leaves, there's only about 100 billion trunks. However, because we can grow after you have a stroke and lose a couple million cells, that's the trunk, of course, away goes the branches and leaves that obviously hold them up. But the remaining healthy cells grow new branches and leaves and grow more and more and more. And that is why it is so plastic, because it takes plasticity, takes the energy from the activities on the outside and converts them into new kind of energy that grows those branches and leaves, metaphorically, within the brain, so that they continue to rebuild the connectivity, because the learning field is up here at the synaptic level. That's where everything works. That's where learning works, and they all connect. What the scientists call, the connections are called the C's. And again, this is 1800 people, early 1900s, talking about the C's. And you've seen that from some of my earlier articles talking about the C's. So the brain is highly plastic. The next one, the brain is changed by experience. Again, people get to understand that a little bit better. But to understand that it is changed by experience, so that's what plasticity is. The full term is experience-dependent neuroplasticity. So plasticity, or neuroplasticity, brain activity, can't go anywhere without the experience-dependent activities. So that is what drives, it creates. It's like the sun converting that into green leaves. You have to convert it from something, and it converted from the thought and cognitive activities that are converted into these new branches and leaves. And again, you've seen this before, Donald Head Hebb, we talked about that earlier. He is the one taking all this together and talked about that cells that fire together wire together. So again, cells by themselves, they're very powerful, but they don't do much unless they connect with others and others and others and others. And that is how that happens. And all those cells in our brain now are all well connected. But if something is lost, they have to build new branches and leaves, and they have to reconnect with others that have the information, but they can't yet express as much as they would like without making those connections. So you need more of them to build what you need going forward. To be able to use somebody like me who could not read, write, or speak well, clearly I got better. There is no other reason than all of the work I did that was so bad for the first couple of years. Again, most of you know that, writing in my diary with words that didn't make any sense. Now I can. How did that happen? Because it had to create those additional C's going forward. And that comes from Hebb here, and the thing that most people do know about if you study MBE science, that the cells that fire together wire together. So if they're here and they start to fire, if you're near each other, this one starts, oh, what's that guy doing? And they start doing what that one is doing. And again, that's all so important. Another one of these concepts is that brains connects new information to old, which is also common sense if you have a little bit of thought about that. Obviously, the all new information is connected to old information. Why? Because the foundation for anything that is coming into your body and integrating that new information, if you remember that word integrate, that comes from Shirlington, which we talked about earlier this year, who's the one who coined the word syntaps and integration. When we think or bring in new information, read it, hear it, watch it, listen to it, that is how the information gets into the brain. And then it integrates that and it connects. Now that it's converting into new dendrites and synapses, then it connects to prior knowledge, earlier knowledge, old information, because it's a foundation. It just happens to be a foundation, not like asphalt on the street, but the foundation of these neural networks that have been built over time. So I was 59 with my first stroke. This is the foundation. Yes, a few of these here and here and here were lost, but this huge foundation of 100 billion cells and the trillions of synapses that are upholding all of that, that is how it builds in new information back into these more, I'll say ancient, but not 59 years, but old roads that are engraved into the brain. So they connect in that way. So that is several of the concepts of MBE science. And many people, all people need to learn about MBE science. Every teacher needs to learn about that. It isn't to say that you should go do different things. Teachers already have the common sense they need. They just need to learn, excuse me, what I needed to learn was what's the foundation for what are you already doing? And for the most part, you are already doing all these things that otherwise, once you learn more about it, you go, oh, I'm doing this, and this is why. This is how the brain works, because I do these things. And because I do these things, my brain gets better, or my students get better, and then they can tell me how they feel the new information that they now have embedded in their own brain. So that is how learning happens. That's how education happens. But we need all people in the world, especially the educational community, who, again, already have their skills. They need the additional component of that is understanding the foundation for all learning, which is what plasticity is, the foundation for learning, of all learning, so that they can understand how plasticity converts the thought and cognitive activities. Basically, all the students in your class, they are converting into new brain matter every single day, hour, minute, second. Because tomorrow, when your students come home, come back to school, and now we're going to talk what we talked about yesterday, clearly, they will remember. And just the fact that you are remembering means that new cells and their associated branches and leaves have built in new that are rememberable. And that too is important to know. So we all need to work on that. And I always like to say this. This is about, now this is James, yet again, a long, long time ago, 133 years ago, talking about this exact same thing, and why it's so important about education to learn more about MBE science is, as he says here, which is so amazing, I'll read it all. It is beyond time, this is me quoting this, it is beyond time for everybody in the public at large, and especially the educational community, about the brain, the organ of learning, as the greatest thing, quote, in all education is to make our nervous system our ally instead of our enemy. And that is too, because a lot of people just really don't think about or consider or appreciate science. You have to understand when it comes to MBE science and education to make this all work. So for all of these scientists I've been talking about, I mentioned before, I think we're at 19. We only have 5 more to go before the 24 in the series. And James, all of them are incredibly important in their own way, from their own perspective. But James is one of the foundational people in the world of the brain. And of course, with stroke and aphasia, of course. But I'm going beyond this, obviously, because we're not just here to talk about somebody who got better from a stroke. We're really talking about how the brain works for everybody in the world, and especially the educational community. So it's great to see everyone. The next article comes out in a couple of weeks, and it is all about John Dewey, the educator, who turns out to be a highly efficient, understandable of neuroeducation and neuroscience. How did that be? He's an educator. How did he become the neuroeducator that we'd like to have people know about today? And we will talk about that. But the hint is here that William James and John Dewey became friends. And actually, James actually had a book go to Dewey for him to read and review and give him information, basically crediting and checking on that book about plasticity. So that's how it all started with Dewey, and that starts in a couple weeks. Anyway, have a great time. Thank you very much, and I will see you soon. See you later. Bye-bye.